native bees are very flower constant, and as Robert was saying before, they're very particular to the flowers they go to, but when they're going to a single species, they're pretty consistently going there. They also use their pollen is that they pack or that they have on their bodies when they're flying around is drier than what honeybees will be delivering to a flower. They're active earlier in the season. They fly in cooler and damper conditions, especially bumblebees, because they're so large and they can stand to get a little bit wet. And they fly faster, pollinating more plants per minute than other insects, including honeybees. And they're so important for all ecological reasons of the services to crops, native plants, wild animals and fruits, and all the other parts of the plants that feed off of these pollinated plants. The key top priority to be providing for the highest number of bee species and the highest abundance of each species. Therefore, we would get more resilience to that. This was shown before, this of the ideal habitat, and so when we're gardening, we could be thinking about all these things that bees need. Water being one of the big ones, because a lot of them can get, a lot of bees in particular can get water from plants after it rains, and they can get it in the morning off of dew. But also, it's very critical for them to have water all through the day. So if you have a big garden, it'd be good to have shallow watering bowls that they can get water from. We can also provide flowers. One of the big other necessary other parts of their habitat is places for them to nest, which is much more difficult. Most of them nest in, I can use a pointer. Most of them nest in the ground, and we are very unfamiliar with seeing bees coming out of the ground, and it's very difficult, as Robert had said, that they're very hard to find. It's hard to study them, but we need to increase our awareness that they're there. So whenever we see bees sticking out of something that looks like an anthill, if we stick around a little bit longer, it might be some other critter living in that hole, and it could likely be a bee, especially if you don't see ants coming in and out rapidly. It's probably some other insect, and could possibly be a bee. Also, bees nest in wood blocks, and which are things that we can create that mimic the holes that they're using, that were created by beetles, usually in dead trees. And they also utilize various shrubs. Oops. And trees, dead trees, and we're mimicking that when we create wood blocks. So that's the ideal habitat. So usually I talk about nesting, but a lot more than that little short spiel there. But the next thing is diversity of flowering plants. It's another one of their critical needs. So when we're designing, we have a number of things to think about. A lot of times we can just dig a hole and put a plant in the ground, and probably will survive, especially if it's gardening. But in landscape terms, we're looking for what type of landscape. That is it near a water's edge, or is it in a woodland or a woodland edge, or is it a meadow? What kind of soil does it have? Is it clay, sand, or loamy? That is wet, dry, or mesic? Is it in the sun, or is the spot location, is it in the sun, or do you have land that's partially sunny, or is it also shady? And also considering the heights and spread of plants, because plants that are taller are more dominant in the landscape, and they're really important for not only aesthetic reasons, but also for bumblebees to try to navigate through a landscape if they have some some taller plants. They come up out of foraging. And are going back to their nest. They'll have some cues. So structure is important also for aesthetic reason for other plants that can grow around them. Also, we want to consider the plant's growth habit. How aggressive is it? Does it stay in one spot mostly, or does it seed tremendous amount, or does it also send out runners? Because if we're putting plants together, we want to know these things. We want to have some plants that are going to survive. We don't want to have a very aggressive plant, tall, aggressive plant next to it. Also, we want to be thinking about the leaf, the color of the leaf, texture, its shape, and its size. And also the flower shape and color and its tube length. So one of the first considerations is how much moisture is in the ground. So a lot of plants are scientifically categorized by whether it's grows mostly in the water or whether it's partly in the water, or usually occurs in wetlands, or does it occur in wetlands and not wetlands, or is it a very dry species or something in between, which most plants probably are. Also, one of the things you want to have when you're starting is to have a good list. This is one of the simple lists that came out of Exercity Society a number of years ago, and it's still in some of the pamphlets that are available. This is a nice list, but it's fairly limited. It's good to know the color of the flower and the height of the flower, and then it's just an easy way to organize if you're designing, to say what size is it in general, and then early, mid-spring, late spring. I think that's, I'm not sure where this is here, but it's like it's kind of hard to read. But I think this is summer, and this is fall, and this is spring. So it's a very simple list. I got kind of started with the list like this, but I kind of don't really refer to it much anymore. But then the NRCS came out with a really beautiful list for a very simple list as well, but showing the plants for two different seed mixes, whether dry or wet. And one important part about this was that you can see the color of the flower, general color of the flower, and whether it's early, mid, or late. The recommendation was always about at least 3 species blooming in each season. So if they're overlapping, if you have more in one season, you're more likely to have flowers that are overlapping. And so this was a nice, simple list to start with. But then there's Jane Sorensen from Riverberry Farm up in Vermont. She came out with this list. I thought it was not only functional but beautiful as well. It's really great to live with, great to design with, and it has lots of great information and showing the bloom period of these plants that are long-lasting, minimal spreading, and reseeding. So in garden terms, we generally want to have plants that we can control until we get to know the other plants more and how they really grow, what their habit is like. But I like showing the color and all of these plants all in one place, and showing the plant height and spread and different notes about the plants. And I think fairly limited on, okay, bees go to these plants, so it's not too much information, not really great information, but a great way to look at plants if you want to limit yourself to those plants that are just long-lasting perennials with minimal spreading. Then we came across, I said, this is such a good idea, I'm going to do it for a project for some very hot and dry site. It was at the Hitchcock Center. I broke them down into three categories according to their size. And so, oops, I'm sorry, excuse me. So this is a structural layer. These are the tall plants, forbs, or perennials and grasses. And these are the seasonal layer, seasonal theme layer, that is smaller plants that bloom seasonally. Of course, the larger plants are going to bloom seasonally too, but they have so much structure because of their size. Smaller plants, about 3 to 4 feet high or so, set against something really tall, can really be strikingly beautiful, and you can see waves or layers or streams of these plants in a seasonal sense when they bloom. It becomes a nice way of ordering the design. And also there's the lower, the functional layer, which are the ground cover plants anywhere from 2 feet down, that aren't, they bloom as well, but they aren't as important as bloomers as they are as far in terms of holding the soil intact and being they hold the soil. That's a basic thing, and they crowd out other plants and weeds, so your planting become more stable more quickly. So the structure of the taller plants is really important because it creates more niches. So more bees can fly around. If you have a big plant here blooming and another one tied up against it, smaller down on the ground, even more filling all the light, partitioning the light, so that there's more maximum flowers. It creates more niches, so there's more bees that can live there, more pollinator diversity. This is a site in Greenfield that designed with a fair amount of tall plants on this northeastern edge of the property, and they were planted in with anicisibs and cedar cup plants, and the tall coreopsis and Maximilian sunflowers and joe pye are fairly large plants. Then planted down below are the geraniums and the anicisibs and some other ground covers on the other side, which are more like a sedum. So just to give you the idea that how structuring, if you imagine yourself as a bee, you were flying around when these were in flower. This is not a picture of them in flower, but they would have more places to hide or more places to travel for when they're foraging. Therefore, more species can interact in the same environment. So another consideration is to maximize flower density, that is to get more flowers and blooming all at once. That has kind of the same effect of boosting whatever species is foraging there. So if you have the recommendation is usually something about 3 or 4 feet by 3 or 4 feet as far as one species is concerned, and generally it's fairly small. You consider one plant could take up 3 by 3 or 4 by 4 foot space. So packing and plants in is another ecological. You have an ecological advantage of labor intense. The lack of lower labor intensity through packing your plants in rather than putting them all out as specimen plants like we usually garden will create less labor and more flower density. And so the number of flowers that we have in a planting is also important. It's a direct relationship by the number of different flowers to the number of species that can live there. So more plant species equal more pollinator species in general. Of course, if they're all of the same family, you probably get the same family of species visiting there. So one of the big considerations is mixing your families of plants together. So talking about diversity of species, England, who is much further ahead than we are, way further ahead than we are, have a lot of citizen science out there, scientists collecting data, identifying bees and butterflies now. And this big study in 2014, they logged 830,000 bees, and of all the different landscapes, including parks, gardens, and the countryside, these allotments, which are British community gardens, they were the highest. They had the highest diversity. So it always makes me feel good whenever I see a community garden. And also, richness of species has that the higher number of plants you have, more color, more flower colors and shapes, the better off, the more you're going to promote diversity. And it's showing the basic 10 flower shapes. So more like the open flowers are very easy to access, where pollen like this is extremely great. Like from willows in the spring, it's really important to have them, because the pollen is just right out there available. And some pollen is a bit trickier to get to. Some bees, bumblebees, have the strength to get into some of these bigger flowers that have like little traps. So there's a certain amount of force that a bee has to exert to get into them. And some flowers just can't be got. Oops. See the bumblebee there is got to get down to there. So probably getting its body all the way in and then stretching its tongue out as far as possible. That's making it only possible for that bumblebee is the only possible pollinator for that plant. So as we go through the season, there's some easy things to think about besides honeybees and bumblebees competing for the same flowers. So we're going to start in the spring with willows and other early flowering plants. But willows are the first. The skunk cabbage was mentioned by Evan. When I think about the spring ephemerals, which aren't that many of them, but they're really important. A lot of them can grow in the forest floor before the leaf canopy, before the leaves of the trees bloom out or press out. And so they're really available, really important, and we can also bring them into our gardens, especially our shade gardens. By the way, and all these lists we will be sending you, so you don't have to try to write them down. I just put this together because I went to see Dr. Gregor's talk at the NOVA conference this past weekend, and he really drove home to me the importance of so many shrubs, especially early flowering shrubs, for their pollen that they produce. And I had mostly been interested in perennials or forbs, and it's really changing my thinking around how do we get the most pollen to the highest number of bees as fast as possible. So this is pretty critical. It's going to be reorienting my thinking to think about how we can place more shrubs and trees in the landscape, or how I would start placing them. So after the spring is over, then we want to think about there's literally thousands of plants we can choose among, but we want to be thinking about how many, well, there are just a lot of them to think about, so it's good to be having a list, but so there's a wide variety to choose among. And then we end the year with goldenrods and asters, which bump up the stores of bumblebees and honeybees and butterflies as well. some species like asters there are lots of different kinds of them. And here's a design I really like. I would just wanted to tell you about. Can you hear me? Yeah. There are 3 species of asters right here. This is New England aster. It can get to about 6 feet, but I cut it back so it only gets to 4. This New England Aster oblongifolia, and that goes fairly well into early October. And this blue skies, Aster blue skies, is really comes in after the. I'm sorry, this is cordifolia, and cordifolia is followed by Aster oblongifolia. So you can have somewhat of a nice little arrangement of having them with each other, next to each other, and then one following the other in bloom. So just among the asters in the fall, you can have a great bump up of stores for the bees to go into winter with. And you think of bumblebees when they go into winter, when they're hibernating off their fat. They're using the energy of their stored sugars that turns into fat in their bodies, and they shiver. And that little shiver gives them a little bit of heat to resist the freezing temperatures of the hole that they're in. They're probably in some kind of a rodent hole, deeper into the ground. And when it gets cold, it gets pretty hard to survive, especially this year with no snowfall. And they're in the ground, on the bare ground, in these really low temperatures. They really needed a lot of asters and goldenrods at the end of the year to survive that. So when you're designing pollinator habitat, you select at least 3 species that bloom per season, and but maximize really with 6 or 7 or even more. Create structural diversity to fill in spatial niches and have more capacity for species, a diversity of species to live off that land. Include native shrubs and forbs from diverse families, and 10 to 15% warm season grasses, which are important for bumblebee nest. That is, if you have a wilder location, then bumblebee nest and nest in these grasses, the tall grasses. When they fall down, it's possible for them to nest the next year in underneath the cavity where the grass has fallen down. There's a little hole in there where they can put a nest that's about the size of a softball. They don't need much space, but the grass falling over creates like a little roof shed for them to stay dry under. And to choose native plants as much as possible, because native plants, native bees and butterflies all co-evolve with native plants. So boosting them, keeping them at a higher level, higher number in our landscape is critically important. So here's the list we'll be sending you. It's of the, this came from Heather Holmes.
We passed it out.
We passed that out. Oh, great. So this is a wonderful list. So it's not categorized by soil moisture, but they're all sun-loving plants. Just touch briefly on this connectivity and corridors business. If we, what if we planted the border of our yards? Everybody's yard had a border, say maybe 3 or 4 feet. We would go a long way towards solving our pollinator crisis if we had a diversity of plants flowering along our borders. And then what if we brought it out to the verge, or between the health strip or the tree, what is it called? Tree belt. How about we planted it in the tree belt? That's a wonderful resource. Since our roads are major corridors, if we planted in that verge, if everybody planted something in their verges, they would This would be remarkable corridor connectivity and boost to all pollinators. It's just one little last slide, I believe, in a proposed corridor that I'm working on in Greenfield. We have a group of folks at the new community center where we planted over 72 species in a beautiful garden here. And first year we had lots of success. We didn't lose one plant. We had plenty of rain, which was really good. But we wanted to connect this to a very highly diverse energy park, which is down off of Mile Street, if anybody's familiar with Greenfield. Anyway, we're proposing two possible ways to get there. And right now we've started meeting. We've had 2 meetings already, and it's really going strong. But we're hoping that all along those corridors we can have lots of different plants. And one of the big places here is a great big parking lot with lots of grass around it. So our eyes are on that parking lot. We're going to see if we can, if the city will allow us to plant there. Do you have any more? A minute?
1 minute.
So just look on a larger scale. There's a project I did for a landowner in Ashfield. Looked at 5 different areas to assess for pollinator habitat. One would be around the hayfield, which would be a pretty important spot, but very big undertaking. The other was around the orchard. And then one in a blowdown area, much more difficult strategy. One was up around the house, which you don't see outlined here. And the other was the interface between the hayfield and the homescape. My client asked me to choose one, and the one I chose was the interface, because not only would it be pleasing for all the folks living, working in the studio, living in the home, and working in the garden, it'd also be pretty good for all of the pollinators that are living in the hayfield, probably scrounging for life in the hayfield. But also, this could carry connectivity from the woodland edge all along here, on this side of the property, and then the farm, neighbor's berry farm on the other side. So there's lots of advantages to this, and it was my favorite one because of the view that you would have out looking through it and being able to see your work more up close. Okay, good. I'll stop here.